For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010, we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer.
Oh, Heavenly Father, who knowest us to be set in the midst of so many and great dangers, that by reason of the frailty of our nature, we cannot always stand upright. Grant to us such strength and protection as may support us in all dangers and carry us through all temptations, through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Well, thank you, Kelby. This is Dan Happel for another installment of Connecting the Dots, and this is the Thursday evening, November 2nd telecast, and we have the great pleasure of having Mary Fanning and Alan Jones back for a repeat of a program that they did a two-series program back in February of this year. And Mary and Alan, you've done a lot of additional investigation, and over the last 9 months have turned up quite a few new connections and new issues that need to be reported to the American people. And I thank you for being guests on our program tonight. And Mary, I'd like for you maybe, and if you would do for Alan, kind of briefly describe what your background and some of the publications and the things that you work on.
My background is a researcher and writer. First, my website is theamericanreport.org. And we started working together, other researchers, writers, people who had news websites, because the American people were not receiving the truth. And when the information came out about the Journo list, and they were a group of journalists that were working and supporting Obama who were bringing the news to the people, but it wasn't the truth. So we decided to reverse engineer that and to work together to bring the truth to the American people. In doing that, we wrote a series, The Betrayal Papers, and we explained the Muslim Brotherhood and their connections in the United States, Muslim Brotherhood, ISNA, the people that were involved, how they connected to Barack Obama. we also explained who Barack Obama is as much as we know, as he's a mystery, an enigma. And the next project, one of the next projects, is the Gutter Awareness, Qatar. And we exposed who Qatar was, which is where the Muslim Brotherhood is headquartered out of. And as we exposed them and also all the American corporations and universities that were working with them, but they weren't just working with Qatar, they were building truly the crown jewels of America's education system and corporate in Education City in Qatar. So Georgetown School of Foreign Service, Harvard, now Harvard Law Sharia, Cornell Medical School, the crown jewels of our system were being built, but Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood were building them for free. Our institutions did not have to pay a dime for a off-site campus to be built in Qatar and Education City. So we exposed the people that were working with that, and lo and behold, the information took hold, and people started hearing the word Qatar, and most Americans have become aware of it, and they started to understand the Muslim Brotherhood, and so we were very successful with reverse engineering the untruths into bringing the truth to the American people. So Alan and I started working, and we did several pieces. One of them was we refer to as the Clues piece, which put together all the people that were working with Barack Obama. But as we investigated that and went through the FBI vault, the information was stunning. We came across people who were connected to Barack Obama who went back to the Silver Masters, and those were the spies that came in from the Soviet Union, had then come into our government, to every area of our government during World War II. And lo and behold, the people who put together the campaign art, etc., for the Obama campaign were related to the Silver Masters. They also had connections to Subud, the cult basically that Obama was in when he was growing up in Indonesia. In fact, if any of that is true, that he was growing up in Indonesia. So as we exposed that, the connections became apparent that the American people were not receiving the truth. About that time, we started looking into Port Canaveral, as we heard. It didn't just happen that it was on the table that people were talking about, that Port Canaveral was possibly going to bring someone in and take over the cargo container operations. There was no notice to it. There was no open bidding process as was required, and that drew our attention because one day they simply announced and had a signing ceremony and turned Port Canaveral over to a family from the UAE. In the dead of night, no announcements, no one knew who these people were. Suddenly we just knew that GTUSA Gulftainer now had the cargo container operations to a U.S. port. However, most people remember the consternation that took place when the Dubai Ports World took over 6 ports. There was so much friction, and people refer to it as the debacle. As we looked into that, we understood that Bill Clinton was the advisor for the Dubai Ports World deal with the UAE. So we started unraveling the lies and started looking into the people who were handed a port in the United States, which truly gives all sorts of bad actors access. One of the things we found as we started looking, and you know what, it's interesting, as you talk to people, and we spoke to a very seasoned man, Glenn Wynn, who had been in the Secret Service, then went into the ports and airport security business. He's one of the top consultants in that area. And we came to know that in California, at one of our ports, there was a man who was in charge of that port, who's also part of Homeland Security, who on air, when being asked, about what comes into the port, he faltered, and he could not speak to the reporter. But then he had a minder who was correcting him his name was Al Haller, as he was speaking, and it was interesting because you could understand that he was being told not to talk. Well, we came to find that a weapon of mass destruction had come into that port, and they were hiding that fact from the American people. Not only that, then we understood that Al Haller was called to Washington, D.C., and dressed down, fired, and made very afraid to speak to anyone. So at that point, we really started digging in.
Well, you've done a tremendous amount of research, and I would refer back to your report, What Could Possibly Go Wrong? That was written in December of last year, and that really got into much of the detail on how the Port Canaveral deal had been put together and turned over, and how the Gulf Container became the manager of the port facility at Port Canaveral, Florida. And in that report, I'd like you to maybe you or Alan to talk about how what you discovered as far as the insider collusion that went on that put that deal together.
I'll let Alan speak to this a little bit. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for having us back on the program tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank you, incidentally, both of you folks, for having the courage and conviction to come on and talk honestly to the American people, unlike the prostitutes that happen to be covering the mainstream media.
To address your question about our background a bit, I just wanted to mention many of your listeners have probably heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. Well, while Mary was busy working on her betrayal papers, I was working as an investigative journalist for the Washington Times Communities, which was a group of citizen journalists, and I focused on national security investigations. Two things after President Obama came into office really caught my attention. The first was shortly after he took office, there was the students in Tehran who were starting to push back against the Islamic regime, and it looked like there was potentially going to be an overthrow of that regime. And I was stunned when I saw President Obama's response, which was to not lift a finger and not express any support of the United States toward that movement. Then following that, there was the incident with Terry Lakin, who was the Army flight surgeon who asked to see President Obama's records before being deployed on another tour to Afghanistan, and he was court-martialed. And I started to investigate him, and my first big investigative piece was into the background of Barack Obama's Selective Service document, and there appeared to have been a cover-up at Selective Service. So interestingly, an investigation of Obama eventually became useful in understanding what happened at Port Canaveral. So this is all part of a bigger picture, and likewise, his response to Iran, as puzzling as it was at first, when you understand the connections between the Port Canaveral deal and Iran, it all starts to make sense.
Okay, well, would you get into that background and that information to help our listeners kind of put this all together?
Well, when we started looking into the port and we began looking at several things connected to the Jaffers, we started seeing an awful lot of Iranian connections. Their director of strategic development was a man named Saimak Namazi. Saimak Namazi is an Iranian. He served in the Iranian army. He was an Iranian government official who then took American citizenship when he went to college in the United States. But timeline was he became an American citizen and then served in the Iranian army. And that is typically not even allowed, particularly when the relationship that we hold with Iran. So it was very interesting that we looked at this man who is the head of strategic development for the Jaffers, one of the Jaffers company, is this Iranian. Subsequently we found that he went to a ports conference and for Gulf Tainer, with Gulf Tainer officials before they were handed our port. So as we started looking into Simek Namazi, we found the connections between he and his father, and Simek Namazi and a man named Trita Parsi, who is a foreign national. So he also has dual citizenship in Iran and in Sweden. And Trita Parsi and Simek Namazi created the NIAC. That's a group that pretends to represent American Iranians. But in fact, when we looked into court documents, NIAC is working and has the blessings of the Iranian government. And so, fortunately, in a court case that they were involved in, they, on several occasions, refused to hand over emails. They finally did. The judge penalized them. Then the emails were exposed, and they showed that Simek Namazi and Trita Parsi were working together with NIAC, which was the lobbying group working with our White House and several people in the State Department to put through the Iran deal. So here we have this man who's the director of strategic planning for the Jaffers company, working with secret emails with Trita Parsi, as Trita Parsi visits the White House on 33 occasions as they put through the Iran deal.
Wow, you really did connect the dots.
Yeah, we did.
So here we have an employee of Crescent, which is the parent company of Gulf Tainer. They employ Simek Namazi. He's an Iranian American who is helping direct the strategic direction for Crescent in the Middle East, their oil deals with Iran. By the way, they've done quite a bit of business with Iran. And at the same time that he's doing that, you have these secret negotiations going on under code name Project Pelican in the United States, unbeknownst to the American people, in which this company from the Middle East that no one knows anything about suddenly appears with a lease in their hand at Port Canaveral. And there was no mention of Iran. There was no mention of Iraq. The only mention was made that, hey, this is a company, they've got a new name, GTUSA, they're from the United Arab Emirates, those are our friends. End of story. Well, no, there's much more to the story. And Simek Namazi, being not only an Iranian American, but one who has worked on behalf of the Iranian government and whose partner, Trita Parsi, was going in and out through a revolving door at the White House while Project Pelican was being negotiated. And that Simek Namazi had actually attended a conference dealing with the cargo container industry in Abu Dhabi, I think spells that there's much more to the story, that there's a serious White House connection, and that was reinforced when we discovered that Badr Jaffer, who's one of the second-generation members of the Jaffer family, his uncle is Dr. Jaffer, who we're going to talk to you about in a few moments. He's a nuclear physicist who headed Saddam's nuclear program. But Badr Jaffer himself, according to visitor logs, visited the White House in March of 2014, just 6 weeks before the Port Canaveral Gulf Tainer deal was announced.
Yes, the American people at this point have no idea that the Gulf Tainer, the secret Project Pelican deal, is even on the table. They don't find out until the deal is announced the same day that Badr Jaffer flies into the United States and signs for the deal. Now, when we did a FOIA request and we received the documents, they had, this big signing ceremony, and they show that he's signing, and when we get the documents, he's not the one signing, and they show Peter Richards And so all of a sudden, Peter Richards is made the president of Port Canaveral, yet, John Walsh. When John Walsh is made the president of Port Canaveral, we look into his background, and he not only has no port experience, but he has a company that no one knows about called Watersmark LLC, and he's working for some royal families out of the Middle East, and he's building kind of housing and malls that all have a very Middle Eastern flavor to them. And so when we look at this John Walsh, he doesn't add up either. And his partner in building these Middle Eastern communities is a man named Miguel Lucel. Miguel Lucel is a man from Puerto Rico who's closely associated with Hillary Clinton and, in fact, has given $1 million to one of her foundations.
Wow.
I think it was the Clinton Library she gave $1 million to.
Yes, exactly.
And he was also a senior advisor to her 2008 presidential campaign.
It's amazing how these connections are all there, and I'd like to give you just let's take a few minutes just so that you can kind of make the connections between the Clintons, between these people that you're mentioning here, and also President Obama and the people in his White House and his personal staff, how this is all connected with this.
Well, as we look into this, we start seeing that Bill Clinton is connected to the Jaffers through a foundation, two foundations, and we start seeing the connections through also Bill Clinton's Education Foundation. In fact, this is a word to the wise. Anytime you see a foundation at this point, these big foundations, be it GEMS or Bill Clinton's foundation, they appear to be a money laundering scheme. Bill Clinton is working with the Jaffers, then he turns around and he gets very large speaking fees. They connected to that then are people who then pledge, and I want you to listen to this number carefully, they pledge $70 billion with a B to the Clinton Foundation. Now, what do you think that they were pledging $70 billion for?
Wow.
Access for when Hillary was elected is the only thing that you can assume.
What's interesting in both the Gulf Tainer deal and the Uranium One deal is suddenly among the players in these national security, international nuclear deals, you suddenly find an interest in donating to foundations in support of educational missions.
Particularly online educational missions. So as we started looking at those foundations, we also saw some other connections, and we started to see that the Jaffers were involved in something called the Abraj Group. Now, the Abraj Group gained some attention because of KE Electric in Pakistan, and they were receiving monies from our State Department, $150 million, $200 million. It was over $450 million in the end. So Hillary Clinton is giving these OPIC monies through the State Department, and it was going to KE Electric. KE Electric in Pakistan then comes under investigation. It's connected to the Abraj Group. Then some of the founding partners of the Abraj Group happen to be Hamid Jaffer, who owns Gulf Tainer, one of the subsidiaries of the Crescent Group, and then their other company, Crescent Petroleum. What we find then in the Abraj Group is one of Barack Obama's college roommates, one of them who went on that mysterious trip that no one had ever heard of, and it suddenly slipped into the campaign. that Barack Obama had gone on this mysterious trip during college before he went to Columbia, where a lot of people can never find any records. And Wahid Hamid that is then also on this board of the Abraj Group with the owner of Gulf Tainer that receives Port Canaveral.
In fact, Wahid Hamid is a partner at the Abraj Group in Pakistan. He's a Pakistani national, and he was very close with Barack Obama during Obama's time at Occidental College in Los Angeles, and has continued to maintain a close relationship, visiting Obama at the White House, visiting him at Camp David, flying in the Marine helicopter that takes the president around. Marine 2.
Wow. Okay.
And so as we're looking into those connections, we come across another connection, and that is a man, Vinay Samalapalli. And he comes in, and he's with Obama in college as well. And then he's connected to the Port Canaveral deal. He's at the dedication, and Barack Obama appoints him to be in charge of Select USA. And there were stories written in Forbes, why is this man who is just becoming a U.S. citizen, why is he in charge of Select USA, which is to bring commerce into the United States? And he's never, at this point we find, he's never been employed by an American company. He shows up and he's at the dedication. It's very astounding. He shows up, he's at the dedication, and then we find him making visits and talking to Pakistani businessmen in Sharjah. And so the players that are all involved create an awful lot of concern, because these are not people who appear to be working for the American people. They appear, in fact, to be working to distribute America, and that's exactly what they were doing. Mm-hmm. So at that point, when we put the Port Canaveral deal together, you know, as we like to say, we talk about Don Rumsfeld's quote, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, which are your most dangerous, because then you don't know what you're facing. And as we looked into it, the unknown unknowns, and as we kept digging into this, we just published another paper last week about the CFIUS process. How did this deal get through CFIUS? How did they look at this deal and think, gosh, the man that you're handing the lease to is Saddam Hussein's nuclear mastermind, who was an enemy combatant on the CIA blacklist, which meant shoot to kill. His brother, Hamid, was under investigation by the Treasury Department and 4 congressional committees for his oil for superweapons program through Crescent Petroleum, where they were selling oil to fund Saddam's nuclear weapons program and Dr. Jafar Dia Jafar, his brother's WMD program. So these are the people who were handed Port Canaveral, the cargo terminal. Not only are they handed this port, but then when you start to understand what is in this port, and you know, our Trident submarines are there. Truly, our air, our space, and our sea programs are at Port Canaveral. So our Trident submarines, NASA, our space programs, where our satellites go, where our Doomsday plane, that's the plane where, should, God forbid, a nuclear war come, that plane is up in the air directing a nuclear war.
And then if you really want to go into the Twilight Zone, after they do all that, they bring in these Iraqis that are deeply involved in Saddam's regime and the WMD program with no national security review, with a complete CFIUS no-show where they decide that this doesn't even need to be investigated. They bring these guys in. Then what does John Walsh at Port Canaveral do? But he decides to have a port security conference at Port Canaveral and bring in these experts from Homeland Security and some sort of dog and pony show to make it look like they take port security seriously, when in fact they've actually just committed the most massive national security breach in the history of American ports.
Well, Alan, when they did that, they had this seminar, this program, after it had already been approved. And what was it for? I mean, was it just strictly a dog and pony show to appear that they're doing something about port security, or was it actually something of substance?
That's a good question. Neither of us attended it, but we found out about it afterwards and saw, that this had taken place, that there had been invited speakers from within the Homeland Security community. And I don't even know if those folks were even aware of who the new tenant was there at the port. It was really sort of surreal. Like I said, it's a twilight zone.
But you have to step back for a second, because when we FOIA and got the documents and the contracts, and those that they showed signing it were not the ones who were signing it, and when we understood who Dr. Jaffer Dia Jaffer was, we looked into something else. We started looking into the CFIUS process. How could this get past CFIUS? CFIUS was rewritten, and that law was rewritten after the 2006 debacle with Dubai Ports World. And so it was written with very strict language that a lease was to be treated the same as a purchase, that if anything is in a military installation, critical infrastructure, it has to have much stricter review. But when we looked into this, and we started looking at the people who were involved in the CFIUS process, and what we found was there's a board through the Treasury Department that puts together the information for the voting members of the CFIUS board. And CFIUS is supposed to go through not just this board, but the 16 intelligence agencies. And so when we looked at who was the person in charge of this board that was giving information from the Treasury Department board to the CFIUS board, we came across a man named Eamon Mir. We looked into his background. Eamon Mir was the president of the youth board of ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. When we looked into Eamon Mir, not only was he the president once but twice of this ISNA board. So great, here's a man connected to the Muslim Brotherhood who's approving or not approving and putting together the information to hand over the Uranium One and Gulf Tainer. What we found when we looked into that, a couple of things. The Uranium One program, the information that they were given, they were told it was a Canadian deal. Russia was never told to anyone on the board, so they were flying blind. They did not have the appropriate information. When we looked at the Gulf Tainer deal, they decided to bypass CFIUS altogether. Stunning. To hand a port with our nuclear submarines, our doomsday plane, our space program, our satellites, truly the heart of our national security programs. And so as we look at this, then we see that not only was he the president of the youth board, but we come across ISNA itself. And it was his father, who's a physician in the United States, and his father's partner were the founders of ISNA, Islamic Society of North America. His father's partner, Fay, F-A-I, was arrested, and he was put on trial, and it was proven that he had $300 million from the Pakistani intelligence, ISI, and he was buying off our officials, or buying access to our officials. He was arrested, found guilty, and put in prison as working for the Pakistani ISI.
Wow.
So that they would put someone who had those connections in charge of the information that would be handed to all the people on the CFIUS board is stunning.
Yeah, it is. It's It's absolutely amazing. Now, would you tell our listeners about Dr. Jafar, the nuclear engineer that was the father of the Iraqi nuclear program, and then get a little bit more into his connections with Gulf-Tainer, and then maybe we can talk about how some of these new revelations came to be.
Quite a bit has been written about Dr. Jafar. They coined the phrase the father of the Iraqi nuclear program. What's interesting, though, is that even though the mainstream media likes to use Dr. Jafar's statements as some sort of definitive proof that the nuclear program under Saddam ended after the Gulf War, and that plays into the fairy tale that there were no WMDs in Iraq. In fact, Dr. Jafar has a long history of working closely with the Soviet Union and their intelligence services, and being apparently very well trained in deception and lying tactics. And that's important because when you read about Dr. Jafar, because your listeners might go and Google him, he's known as Dr. Jafar Dia Jafar. There's several different spellings of it. He also appears to have another name, Abu Timan. He was born in the 1940s. Iraq, in the early stages of its nuclear program, they got a primitive reactor from the Russians. He was sent over to Birmingham in the UK, where he studied physics. He then ended up over in Switzerland at the nuclear accelerator over there, CERN. And he also sent some of his underlings from Iraq over there as well to gather information on the use of magnets that actually have an application in the enrichment of uranium. This caused alarm with people over there at CERN, the scientists over there. So he wasn't given a job at Birmingham, and instead returned to Iraq and began in the early 1980s working in Saddam's nuclear program. One of Saddam's early reactors was causing alarm by Begin over in Israel, and the Israelis were worried that Iraq was moving too fast with the nuclear program. So in an operation called Operation Opera, they flew over fighter jets and bombed this reactor. It was then that Dr. Jafar began a secret nuclear program, and the books actually have quotes from other Iraqi scientists who knew Dr. Jafar well, and Dr. Jafar would boast about how he was deceiving the West into thinking that there was no nuclear program, when in fact they were very busy consulting with the KGB, learning all about how to build underground facilities. They had tunnel diggers from Vietnam, and you probably, if you've seen the movies or know anyone that served in Vietnam, you know that tunnel digging was an expertise of the communists in Vietnam. So these guys were working with the KGB and the Vietnamese and building these underground facilities. And Dr. Jafar sent some of his intelligence operatives to the United States to gather classified information. They took all the information they could get about how we built the bombs during the Manhattan Project in the 1940s, and not only replicated that, but improved it. They used what's called electromagnetic isotope separation, EMIS, which was a program in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that used giant magnets to separate the two different isotopes of uranium to create the highly enriched uranium that's needed for a nuclear bomb using something called a calutron. Dr. Jafar improved the calutron, made what's called the Baghdadtron, and they built entire facilities that were basically based on the blueprints, apparently, of Oak Ridge. And this was like Iraq's Manhattan Project.
Yes, your listeners will understand that what he did was repeat with those documents from Oak Ridge, Robert Oppenheimer's. He had his plans. They were available in the library at Oak Ridge, and that is what Jeffer used to build his nuclear weapons. Interesting is that he also built this under the rivers. So this was all deeply underground, with places where you could go in through the mountain, but then you would go down below the Tigris River, and so they did this because the cooling would keep our satellites from seeing any heat with what they were developing. And we had no idea until when we went in and we bombed something, and the response from the bomb was so far beyond what was expected that they knew they hit something that they hadn't expected could possibly be there.
Wow. Okay, now Dr. Jeffer developed something known as the nuclear beach ball.
It's a miniaturized nuclear weapon that he referred to as beach ball, and he actually had planned to take this into the port of Haifa and to the Israelis. And let me step back. So one of the things that he no longer was just creating the bomb, because he felt that the United States, the West, didn't stand up to Israel, that it was unfair. And so they were going to work together to create not just the Iraqi bomb. Dr. Jeffer referred to it as the Arab bomb. So at this point, he's not thinking that he's just representing Iraq. He's representing the Arab world. He feels that they've been humiliated by the West, that they haven't been treated properly by the West. And so when he's working, he's touching base, and this will put everything that you're looking at in context, because he's not just working with the Soviets. The Soviets now have a plan that they're going to create this red-green alliance, and they're going to radicalize parts of Islam in an effort to have them attack America via terrorism.
So the Soviets have been very crafty and clever in the way they've pushed back or tried to defeat the West. And this goes back generations, back to Yuri Andropov and other earlier KGB figures, and that continues from Andropov through Primakov, who we discuss in our latest paper as well. But they, simultaneous to operating a strategic Cold War, right, which involves the nuclear triad, the submarines, the long-range bombers, and the ICBMs and the missile silos. But the Soviets didn't stop there. Simultaneously, they decided to use these Arab Islamic countries to get WMD programs going on there too, and to sponsor terrorism, and to unleash that terrorism against Israel and the United States, and then arm these countries with reactors and assistance in developing nuclear weapons. So the U.S. ends up having to deal with two problems. One is the traditional nuclear triad submarines, the long-range bombers, and the ICBMs. But then all of a sudden there's a new problem, and that is guys like Saddam Hussein building nuclear weapons too. And not just the Arab countries, but you have North Korea, all these other rogue regimes. So it's a program to really overwhelm the West. Not only the Cold War, which then through the perestroika deception, they lied to us and told us the Cold War is over when it was hardly over at all. And they accelerated these programs in Iraq and Iran and all these other regimes, so that now we're really in a very, very serious situation.
No, I agree, and I know that the perception has been that the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union, but in fact that was just a deception to allow communism kind of a free hand. And right now we're seeing the results of that in the United States. We had last week Trevor Loudon was on, and Trevor talked about how we have so many enemies within. And that's why your talk tonight, your program tonight, is so important to outline to our listeners what some of those programs of the enemies within and how the enemies from other countries now have been given an access, a back door to the United States where they can bring weapons of mass destruction into the country in a way that we couldn't have conceived of 20, 30 years ago. So I'll let you kind of fill in our listeners then about the Club K program and some of the things that are going on that explain how that's going to happen.
Well, what we need to understand is the Red-Green Alliance, the Russians working with the Arab world. And so we must really remember that Islam is a sword of communism. And that's what Russia's using against us.
I agree, yeah.
And so that's a very important concept to remember. Jaffer was working with Primakov his entire career. They created the Islamic Bloc. There were meetings in the Sudan. They brought in countries that they would all start working together against the United States. Iran and Iraq and Syria and North Korea, they have been working against us and working in concert against us for some time. This concept was put together by Mr. Primakov. He was the Soviet ambassador to Iraq. He also was leading their KGB at some point. It's breathtaking that Madeleine Albright would sing little ditties from the opera with Mr. Primakov. He's an incredibly dangerous man whose greatest hope was to destroy the United States. And he worked for years and years to do that. That he was working his whole career with Dr. Jaffer and Saddam Hussein should inform how dangerous these people are. But what came next, fortunately, Mr. Primakov has died in the last year and a half. But he trained Dr. Jaffer. Dr. Jaffer's not just a nuclear weapon specialist. He was in charge of the biological, the chemical, the nuclear. He's a spy master himself. And at some point, we translated some Russian videos, military videos, and they talked about the Club K. And the Club K is a Trojan horse. It looks like your typical intermodal cargo container. They come in on ships, they go on trains, they go on trucks, they travel through the country, they go on riverines. So they really have access to our entire country. Well, the Club K that was developed by Russia, the top of this opens up and it will shoot off cruise missiles or nuclear missiles or a nuclear weapon or an EMP. That's terribly disturbing that someone who that Dr. Jaffer was working with has now created the cargo container that can bring nuclear weapons inside America to attack us. But it gets worse. The Jaffer family and Gulf Tainer have gone into a joint venture with the people who produce and export the Club K cargo container, the Trojan horse. So the very family that has a 35-year lease to Port Canaveral has gone into a joint venture with the company that produces and exports the Club K.
And that's is it called Rosso Boron Exports? Exports?
Export. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Rosso Boron
yes.
Export, one word.
Okay.
Right, so that's a part of Rostec, which Putin set up Rostec around 2007, actually using the assets of Rosoboronexport, which is the main arms exporter for Russia. So Rosoboronexport, which is exporting the Club K, is part of Rostec. Now, these are all state-owned companies. There's another state-owned company which is actually manufacturing the Club K, but it really is all the Russian government. These are ex-KGB guys who have a massive military-industrial complex, and Gulftainer and Rostec are working together through a joint venture in Russia. Prominvest is a financial part of Rosoboronexport and Rostec that handles the financial clearing of these transfers of arms to these other countries. It's sort of like a bank for arms exporting, and Gulftainer is in business with these guys. The head of Rostec, the CEO, who was in the KGB in East Germany and Dresden with Putin, they go way back, just like Igor Sechin and Putin go way back. They're working together, and the CEO of Rostec is on the sanctions list. He's considered an SDN, a specially designated national. Also, Prominvest, which is the financial part of Rostec, which is funding Gulftainer's development of a Russian port on the Baltic Sea in Ust-Luga, which is near St. Petersburg, which, by the way, is where Putin is from. That's also considered an SDN under sanctions. So we've got a company here from the Middle East in Port Canaveral that's doing business with people who are under sanctions on the SDN list, which is prohibited under their lease.
And to make that a little bit more interesting, if that's not the...
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it certainly is. But the Jaffers have also taken over Ust-Luga, which is one of 12 ports that are allowed to move nuclear materials. So they have just taken over the management of that port that moves nuclear materials, one of 12 in Russia.
Wow. Okay, let's tell our listeners a little bit about Vladimir Putin and the fact that I think a lot of people have a misconception that somehow he is just some great Russian nationalist and not a communist, and not they forget his connections with KGB, and the fact that the Cold War never slowed down. It just went from cold to secretly hot.
Mm-hmm.
Putin is a great admirer of Yuri Andropov. He recently had an expert on Andropov give a lecture to members of the intelligence community, FSB guys in Russia, telling them what a great guy Andropov is. Putin also eulogized Yevgeny Primakov. Now, these are guys who were titans of the Soviet Union. These were the coldest of the communists. These were the real deal. And these are the idols.
Yeah, these were the
so that tells you who
ruthless.
Putin is.
You have to understand Pacipa, and those who have read Major Pacipa's book, Disinformation, understand, right. And if they've ever watched a video from Yuri Bezmenov, they understand that the communists, the Soviets, the Russians, they come in with propaganda. In fact, a really interesting statistic is that 7 out of 10 military people in the Soviet army, the Russian army, work propaganda. They're not on the ground fighting. They work disinformation. Anyway, Mikhail Pacipa wrote in his book Disinformation, he put a lot of these people in context. And when he came, and he was working in Romania for the KGB, when he left Intel and he defected to the West, he brought a lot of their secrets with him. And his book Disinformation is really an important read for people to understand everything that we're looking at globally. And the disinformation we're being sold this nice guy on that rides bareback and what a strong, tough, wonderful guy Putin is. Putin is evil.
He's KGB. He is absolutely KGB. And if you will allow me just a second here, a few seconds to make a quote, and this is Mikhail Gorbachev in a speech before the Soviet Politburo in November 2nd in 1987. This was before the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, and this is a quote. In October 1917, we parted with the old world, rejecting it once and for all. We are moving to a new world, the world of communism. We shall never turn off that road. Comrades, do not be concerned about all that you hear about glasnost and perestroika and democracy in the coming years. These are primarily for outward consumption. There will be no significant internal change within the Soviet Union other than for cosmetic purposes. Our purpose is to disarm the Americans and let them fall asleep, unquote.
Exactly.
Okay, now go ahead and finish your talk about Putin.
Well, Putin is an evil man. He worked, and as I said, great admirer of Primakov, who worked with Dr. Jaffer. Something that people need to understand is Dr. Jaffer created Beach Ball, the miniaturized nuclear weapon. We've never seen it. We have in our paper the plans for it, but what we have seen, which is terribly disturbing, is Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. The images that are appearing of him on television, he is hugging this sphere that looks very much like Dr. Jaffer's beach ball, his miniaturized nuclear weapon that can be put in, one assumes, into a Club K. So they didn't just have the meeting in the Sudan creating the Islamic bloc. They had another meeting in Damascus. They have the dates. They met in Syria. Syria was involved. North Korea was involved. They met there because they were looking for a delivery system for Dr. Jaffer's beach ball nuclear weapon. And so the North Koreans were coming in to build a factory. But at that point, we went into, with coalition forces, we went into Iraq because of the weapons that they had, and they did have them. In our paper, we also, those who went in, and when they went into Iraq looking for the nuclear weapons, they went into and were infected by the radiology, his medical files. We've shown in the paper that our people got sick, and our government hid this because they politicized the information. They just wanted to win the next election, so they lied about it. They had the Saddam tapes that proved it. They made sure you couldn't get to those. Tyler Drumheller, who long worked with Hillary Clinton, and John Kerry, his wife, was working on his campaign. They hid that information to win an election.
Putin is not only increasing the number of submarines, they're selling submarines to Vietnam and all these other countries. So they're preparing for a traditional war that will be fought like the last war, like World War II, but they're also preparing for World War III, which will be different, like Dr. Peter Pride says. It will be asymmetrical. It'll involve EMPs to take out our electrical grid. It'll involve cruise missile attacks. The Club K is an asymmetrical weapon designed to come into the United States and launch cruise missiles that can travel at supersonic speeds with WMDs or conventional weapons and hit our bases, our cities, our infrastructure before we even know what's happened.
Right. And we're building basically an umbrella or a anti-ballistic missile system that will be completely ineffectual against an attack from the interior of our own country.
In fact, I just spoke to Dr. Pry, and he said, if this had been the greatest generation and they knew about an EMP, he said they would have gone to work, and this would have already been taken care of.
Well, we've talked about this, Mary, and I hate to say it, but we're going to run out of time. Can you guys come back next week?
Oh, I think so.
I mean, I just don't see us being able to get through all the information that we need to be able to talk about. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to right now tell our listeners to tune back in next week because we've got a lot to talk about. And, of course, Dr. Pry is the expert on electromagnetic pulse weapon systems. And, frankly, Mary, you and I have talked about this. I can't believe as long as we've known about the problem that we haven't hardened our systems because it doesn't take that much to harden a system against that sort of an attack.
Well, we have people who want to work into globalism, and people should never hear the word globalism again without understanding that it means global communism.
Exactly.
And yes, we will join you again next week because we need the American people to. We don't have front porches. We need to be talking to one another, and we need to make sure that we get help to stop this.
Well, we've got to, and I'm hopeful that we can get Dr. Pry on at some point to talk about the electromagnetic pulse weapons because that's a huge issue. And I remember, and I can tell you, I remember it clearly. I was 9 or 10 years old when there was a movie with Jimmy Stewart about an attack on Los Angeles with a nuclear weapon, and it was the Russians, and how the nuclear effect took out the electrical systems. And that was back in 1959. I can't imagine how we could possibly let something like this go on that long when we know how straightforward and how fairly simple it is to harden systems against electromagnetic pulse.
We have the people that know how to do it. We have those who want to do it, so why haven't we?
Right. Well, we need to get into the Club K and into the some of the serious weapon systems that are part of that cargo container possibility. And I mean, they are mind-boggling. I'd like our listeners to take a look at, and can you give them the website for your paper on this that also has some video on there about how the Club K containers work?
Yes. They should go to the centerforsecuritypolicy.org. That's centerforsecuritypolicy.org. They may have seen Frank Gaffney, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan. He runs the Center for Security Policy. Claire Lopez, who was with the CIA for many years, was on your show recently. Claire works with Frank. They are people who are, I can't even say they're political. They're people who are hoping to save our country.
Yeah, that's really what it boils down to. We have so much treason and so many bad actors in our own government, in our midst, and we certainly had them over the last 8 years. And all I can say is that God bless President Trump, because boy, did he step into a mess, and they're doing everything in their power to destroy him because they really truly want their one world globalist communist system. And that's kind of an editorial, but it's absolutely true. So, folks, would you come back next week? And Mary and Alan, if you would, please, I'd love to have you come on next Thursday night, and we'll do another a continuation of this discussion.
We'd be honored to be back on the program. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, great. All right. Well, then, to our listeners, please join us again next week, and we will connect a few more dots with you with Mary Fanning and Alan Jones. And I thank our listeners, and I turn the broadcast over to you, Kelby, and I ask our listeners to return next week. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.